opportunity to actually say a few words, because basically I arm wrestled poor David into organising this, because David and I have been talking about the issues that you're going to address today for actually quite a few years, and we're even toying around with basically getting an editor collection together, but as always, you know, schedule's not really allowing it. But this issue of recognizing and making more visible that in the different countries across the world, there are very, very specific conditions that have a real impact on how we can teach television studies, that we all come out of particular academic traditions, that we come out of regulatory traditions, that we come out of you know, institutional bodies, etc. I mean, I'm really lucky because now I have a group of people around me with whom I can do television studies, and I think some of my colleagues would agree with me that one of the reasons why we can do this at Edge Hill University is because it is Edge Hill University, which attracts a particular kind of clientele, which has a particular tradition, etc. So it's not Oxford University, for example. So all of these things impact on how we can do television studies and what kind of television studies we can do. But obviously the differences are particularly stark, I think, if we look at it internationally. And this is why we've decided to invite you all here, and thank you very much for participating. So this explains why basically poor David had to do this. I'm now handing over to him as chair. And
David is not poor. David is actually honored to be doing this. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, Elke, very much. Really, I would just want to repeat and rehash one more time what Elke said. This we've been in discussion about this question, and not just the two of us, but with multiple colleagues, Luca, Giri, included, Rushi, of course, and most lately Alexia, about the different contexts, the different cultural, national contexts of television and television studies, and how those various contexts impact on the development of the discipline and the directions in which the discipline develops, whether television studies is established already in various cultural contexts as a discipline in its own right. So what we're trying to do here today is look at hierarchies, institutional and disciplinary hierarchies, practices of legitimation, classificatory schemas, and of course the space and place of television studies in relation to all those other disciplines within which television studies is sometimes, fortunately or unfortunately, kind of located: media and screen studies, social sciences, or the humanities, depending on the location and depending on the institution. And perhaps Erka would agree with me when I say that perhaps one of the most central or key purposes of today's panel is to offer a possible way to begin a de-Westernization of television studies by paying attention to transnationalization in production cultures and by rethinking micro and micromanagement of production and distribution, also in a kind of post-pandemic landscape. And with that, if you allow me, I would like to introduce very briefly our speakers. We have got Ruchi Kerjagi, who is professor and director of Symbiosis Institute of Media and Communication and Dean of the Faculty of Media and Communication at DMED University, Pune, India. Her research intersects media representations, popular culture analysis, media and children, television studies, and emerging discourses of identity. She also has been awarded the Women Leadership Awards in 2017 and 2019, respectively. And she's also vice chair of the Media Education Research Section of the International Association of Media and Communication Research and the vice president of the Indian Association of Media and Communication Educators. Our second speaker is Luca Barra, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Arts, Università di Bologna, where he teaches television and digital media. His research centers in television production and distribution cultures, the international circulation of media products, TV comedy and humor, among other things. He has authored 3 books in Italian on dubbing, TV scheduling, and sitcoms, and is co-editor of a very recent collection on European TV series, a European television fiction renaissance, published by Routledge 2020, and controversial television humor, Taboo Comedy by Paul Grave 2016. Then we have got Alexia Smith with us, who is senior lecturer teaching film and TV studies at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And her PhD examined effects and visceral displays of the body on contemporary television. So like many of us, including Elke and myself, she is one of those scholars who wrote their PhDs in forensic television / CSI. And that's how we know each other, actually. Her research focuses on popular entertainment television with a particular interest in reality television and gender, and she's currently working on transnational television and women's genres in Africa. And last but not least, of course, Gary Edgerton, who is Professor of Creative Media and Entertainment at Butler University. He has published 12 books and more than 90 essays on a variety of television, film, and culture topics in a wide assortment of books, scholarly journals, and encyclopedias. And he is also co-editor of the Journal of Popular Film and Television. Thank you very much to all 4 of you for joining us. It is a great honor to have you all here. And the format that we kind of thought we would follow is that the panelists would give us a short kind of overview of their respective regional context in regards to television studies, and then we would sort of try to carry on with the discussion, and at a certain point I will open up the discussion also to the floor. We will be taking questions and comments from the floor, from the virtual floor at least, and hopefully this is going to be fine with everybody. So I would like to ask, who would like to go first? I don't know. Rushi, maybe you could begin, if I can ask you.
Thank you, David. And first, thank you, David and Elke, for this invitation. I'm delighted and honored to be a part of this. And also, just before I entered the session, I shared my picture from 2.5 years ago when I was at Ormskirk with all of you at Edge Hill University, and had like this great opportunity to meet so many scholars from television studies, from different parts of Europe in particular, and also from the US. And you know what? Since then, there has been a work in progress, and that is where I like to begin my discussion from. I like to put it as straight as I can put it. Television studies is still not a legitimate academic discipline in India. I'll be very direct about it. There are a few scholars, few and far between, who have been working on different dimensions of television. And this has got a lot to do with how television studies has been positioned in Indian universities. And let me put it like that. So if we look at television studies, it's a dimension of mass communication in departments in India. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there has been a lot of scholarship both in film studies and then after that in culture studies that emerged from India, and they figured out their own theoretical terrain. But something that television studies hasn't been able to accomplish for itself in the Indian context is a theoretical paradigm of its own. Mostly the kind of theories that Indian television studies negotiates with are Western in nature, primarily European and American. So what happens is that the entire theorization is based so much in the Western experience, and we try to kind of recontextualize it in the Indian experience, which is which is a very, very difficult sort of a task to achieve. So one television, and just to put it across, like, because Elka was talking about it before we started, there's not even a single department in any university in India which offers a course in television studies. So it's always a part of a larger course. So I'm just making these points to just give you a context of what kind of like ecosystem exists around, like trying to call yourself a scholar in television studies in India, right? Having said that, I would like to also tell you that what has also happened is that there is not a curation of scholarship in television studies that's happened very well in the Indian context. Now, when I say that, what I mean to say here is that there is a lot of disparate scholarship that television studies is characterized by in the Indian context. So just to put things in perspective, television started in India in the year 1959. It was not until 1995 that private players were allowed to operate in the television sector. So the first private channel ever that came to India was in the year 1995. And in the last, so to say, almost 3 decades, when television became the ubiquitous medium in India in a few years, and everybody got attached to television and tried to look at television in every possible way. It was also at the same time that digital media technologies started exploding, just like in the rest of the world, as much like that in India. So what happened was that television studies never got complete attention in that sense, because a lot of new media technologies and digital technologies were emerging simultaneously. So the attention was extremely divided and everybody was just trying to make sense of that. So if you look at the kind of work that has been published, which can broadly be classified under television studies, which comes from India, there are usually a lot of impact studies that you come across. What's the impact of television? That's the kind of work. Also from a mass communication context, that were the kind of studies that were happening. And then there are very genre-specific studies. So there was a lot of excitement around television news in India always. There still is, right, in every possible way. So how television news works in India was something that a lot of scholars would work on. Sports on television used to garner a lot of attention. In addition to that, one of the favorite subjects that has been researched on has been television soaps and the different layers of gender, the way they structure them. There has been very marginal interest in children's television, but there has been some. And there's like what Alexia works in, there's also been some interest in reality television and the way it's impacting society. Considering the Indian middle class and its aspirational dimensions are one of the most touted discourses in Indian popular culture. So reality television kind of gave that sort of a voice to the aspirations of the middle class. So this has been the kind of work that has been done, but particularly, the entire theorization has been very, very Western in nature. That's one big gap that exists. In addition to that, scholars from different domains other than communication or television have investigated TV. So to say that there is a very genuine scholarship from scholars of television emerging, it's a very difficult thing to find that. So it's basically a historian who is looking to look at TV as a medium of narrating history, and so on and so forth. In addition to that, what I also would like to, how much time do I have, David? Do let me know.
I'm muted, so maybe a minute or two.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Then I also would just like to put it across to all of you here that if I give you an idea of the context of India right now, with a 1.5 billion population, 70% is the penetration of television in India. So like a lot of people watch TV. That's one. Number two, right now, we have 700 million people who have access to internet as per figures that come from 2021. There are 909 linear television channels and there are more than 40 OTT platforms. So if you can just look at the entire canvas of how much media and content is available for people, and despite that, television studies still struggles to find academic legitimacy as a separate domain. I think there is a lot of distance for us to cover. And, and one last thing that I've been trying to attempt now significantly is I'm trying to curate research that has emerged from India in the sphere of television studies decade by decade. I've been doing this for the last few months now, and I want to curate the entire scholarship to understand how television studies has shaped up in India. And at my own department, I'm trying to curate the first ever course, which brings TV1 to TV4 kind of conversation together, which I'll offer in the ensuing semester. So that's like a little bit of an overview, whatever I could put across. I hope I was able to make some sense, but I look forward to the discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rishi. Thank you. Alexia, maybe you would like to cover your
All right, great. I think
South Africa, yeah.
Yes, there's so much commonality, I think, between our context and everything that Ruchi has been saying. I'm like, yes, exactly the same kind of problems. And a very similar thing to do with kind of the history of our television. So I'm just opening my notes here. But thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about television. In my context, I very rarely get this opportunity. So I'm really excited about this discussion. One of the things I kind of want to flag up at the beginning is that being asked to talk about South Africa on behalf of South Africa, I've become keenly aware of my whiteness. And the pool of people studying TV in South Africa is tiny. And I think most of the scholars in the field, if I can find them, because I have the same problem of like actually trying to figure out who is doing the TV studies research. Most of us are white, even though most television viewers in South Africa are Black, and most of the content on South African TV is made for Black South Africans. So I think if we're going to meaningfully grow television studies in South Africa, we also need to transform the field so that Black voices are leading the discussion in a majority Black country. So that's one of the things that I think sort of complicates TV studies in South Africa. I think it also has to do with the fact that television studies, as far as I've been trained in it, also has a very strong kind of Anglo background, so that people who, like me, you know, first language English speakers are perhaps more interested or have more access into the field. And of course, it's also South Africa's deep inequality, the deeply unequal history of our education, etc. That's obviously the result of apartheid. So I hope that that's some of the stuff that we can kind of talk about in the later discussion. As in the case of Ruchi's discussion, television studies is not at all well established in South Africa. I wouldn't really describe it as a kind of a sort of a real discipline that has kind of a group of people working on it. There's very little sort of community of scholarship, but there are people writing about TV, just not really under the banner of a kind of community of scholars who call themselves television studies scholars. And often it's from very different disciplines in different spaces. There's work on TV and media studies. There's work on TV that from historical scholars, particularly looking at TV and the transition out of apartheid. But there isn't a kind of very coherent group of scholars. And I feel quite isolated. Every time I have to engage with like an international conference, I always am worried that I don't know what's going on because I just like often just feel like I don't have anyone to talk to at home. But of course, a lot of this has to do with South Africa's very particular history with television. Due to a ban by the apartheid government, South Africa's first national TV broadcast was only in 1976. So that's a very late entry into TV. And I remember, I mean, I've got old photos of my parents when they went overseas on holiday, and the big novelty was to photograph yourself standing next to TVs because we didn't have them. And of course, it wasn't long before VHS and satellite TV would radically change television viewing, just a few years after we had our first broadcast. And of course, all of that came in very soon afterwards. At the same time, South Africa was going through radical political change, and the industry of television was being deregulated both in South Africa and across the continent. So South Africa's television history has just always been one of tumult. And in fact, it still is, because our national broadcaster has been through multiple kind of crises, and it is constantly kind of falling apart in various ways. So this kind of idea of a kind of a television as an old-fashioned, that television as we knew it, which I see emerging in a lot of discussions, we just have never had that in South Africa. So I sometimes wonder if, that historical moment where television studies could have developed in South Africa has just passed us by. There hasn't really been a moment where the object has been not that it's ever really been stable anywhere, but been stable enough for us to go, television is one thing and we're all going to study it, even though, in fact, many South Africans, still their primary way of watching TV is on an old-fashioned TV. But I do believe that despite these challenges and our unique history and our position in the global South, rather than being an obstacle, I think means that we're poised to make important interventions into the field. We have something to say and we have a unique perspective, but I do think we're missing this opportunity. And some of the problem comes very much from our own context. And I think the usual problems that I think we all experience in universities about funding, about very overworked academics teaching very large courses to often students who are very poorly prepared by a failing school system. So we can read researchers. But there's also kind of the same sort of prejudices about television and the same struggle to justify the field. Part of that, I also think, as African scholars, there's an anxiety about studying things that are considered lowbrow, that are not going to be advancing the best face of perhaps, or what is considered the best face of African culture, but rather seems to be we're looking at these kind of schlocky things. And I know that television scholars everywhere have encountered this problem, but it combines with anxieties about how we represent Africa or what's relevant in Africa. And the other thing that I think complicates matters is a kind of a resistance to Western concepts or theories and applying them to Africa. And I think that this is important resistance because I think we need to question how applicable a lot of the ideas associated with television studies are elsewhere. I mean, I remember studying all those things about intimacy and home and closeness, etc. But my own experience of television has been one of kind of exclusion, difference, outsideness, disruption, which increasingly I think is everyone's experience of it. But there are these things we have to test, but I also think that there's a lot more in common than people assume. There's a huge amount of continuity between African television experiences and those of the rest of the world, and I think we need to acknowledge and explore how connected we are. In the global arena, there's a thriving community of TV scholars, but very little investment in thinking about TV in Africa. And I think there's an assumption that Africa is kind of so backward or there's so much poverty that the rules that we can go by elsewhere simply don't apply. So why are we, applying these things here, or why would we discuss the connections? And I think there's a limited awareness of how well developed and globally connected African media systems are. The other thing that I think I experience is a tendency to kind of treat Africa as a case study rather than to actually radically rethink how, what's going on here actually needs to make us question the theories we're using. So my feeling is, moving forward, there's two things that are urgent, aside from things about funding and all of that, which is another can of worms. But the two really urgent things are, I think the one I've already mentioned, and that is to actually transform our own industry, so that, our own field, so that we're not just trying to grow the discipline, but we're trying to grow it in an inclusive way, and not even an inclusive way, in a way in which is led by Black voices. And secondly, I think we need to move away from being the African case study to prove a kind of general theory. And actually, we need to start thinking about how we can offer more radical and substantial interventions into the field. And we need to sort of be welcomed in that way. So yeah, that's that for now. Thank you so much for giving me this forum. It's been great.
Thank you so much, Alexia. This what you've said, I mean, all these things resonate with so much of my own experience in Central Europe, which I will come back to during the discussion. I don't know. Perhaps we could continue with Luca to have a kind of Western European perspective, more particularly in Italy.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for being here. I can see a lot of familiar names, not faces at the moment. And thanks to the organizers for having me here. I will try to bring to this roundtable kind of a European, continental, major market perspective. Of course, there will be Italian specificities, which is the place where I work, but also maybe some more common transversal ground between similar intra-European countries. I would say Western, but non-Anglophone countries, which is kind of relevant for our discussion. You sent us a lot of questions. I will try at least to highlight 3 points and a series of doubts. The first point, working in Italy in a way helps me to show how what constitutes television changes geographically. So, of course, one thing we all know that very well, television is mainly a national industry, has mainly a national history. We have already seen that in this roundtable. We are looking, and we can look at transnational flows, at global entanglements, at global parallels, influence, models, and so on. Also to have a common ground, to understand each other. But of course, this is a partial, incomplete, somehow biased perspective. Television is a lot contextual, and context is often nationally situated. So it's difficult to properly understand a national television. Furthermore, and it's more or less the same thing, but looking at content, at TV shows, at programming, and so on, at the more textual parts of television, TV changes a lot. If I look at Italian television, at the television of many European continental countries, television is especially general entertainment, non-fiction genres, reality, news, information, sports, and so on. Yet, as scholars, also as Italian scholars, we are mainly looking at fictional content, at television series, sometimes at television formats. Probably one of the reasons is because the textual dimension, it's easier to find there, so the tools of analysis are more developed, but I guess there's also a strong influence of the US categories of quality of relevance. So this is also not only, of course, but reflecting some systems of power, some systems of recognition, the kind of products that US television is mainly made of and that travel around the world, Italy included. So television is multiple, but often we underlook this multiplicity. And so this is the first point, to have a closer look, and the difficulty of actually having in my own work and research a closer look to contextual elements and to this multiplicity of genre and languages and aesthetics and so on. Second point I want to raise is that the Italian case history in a way shows also how what constitutes television studies changes geographically a lot, even in our interactions at a European or a global level. I would divide a couple of ways to look at it. One is kind of informal relationships. Television studies, as it has already been said, is kind of a lateral lateral field, lateral frontier between established disciplines and perspectives and methodologies and so on. This interdisciplinarity is at the same time a big strength, something that makes television studies extremely challenging and interesting and fun also, but it's also a strong weakness if we look at the discipline and at the circulation. I have learned about this push towards interdisciplinarity in theory since my first university here. 20 years have passed, a lot of people still say a lot about this interdisciplinarity and this need. This is constantly repeated, but it's always contradicted in practice because we also have to take into account the formal relationships. In the Italian academic system, it's just an example, but more or less these are the struggles we all have. Rucci was talking about the mass communication connection of television studies. In Italy, television studies is inserted together with film studies and photography studies. There's actually a discipline which is called film photography and television, and thank God that there's the name television in it. We are very lucky. We feel very lucky about that. Not everyone has the same fortune in other fields of media studies, but there are no media studies as a discipline, as a sector in the institutional academia in Italy. And there is an even more large group where we fit in, which is together with theater, performance studies, classical music, popular folk music, ethnomusicology, and so on. And so, of course, these are the kind of scholars you need to dialogue, at least inside the Italian system, and you have less and less strong connection with a lot of other dispersed scholars who are actually looking at television in a sociology of culture framework, in a contemporary history framework, in aesthetics and semiotic frameworks, which are in other groups. And so the connections, at least in Italy, are quite low, and we rebuild this kind of connection at a European, at a global level. And this impacts on the objects of studies. If you have to dialogue with film scholars, you will look at television in a way more than another. If you have to be understood by a commission evaluating your work composed with people doing classical music, it's another thing you have to take into account, of course. This impacts in the objects and, of course, in the career. Very early in my research career, I was advised, and it was a great piece of advice. Now I complain about that, but I'm very grateful about that, not to publish a work I've done on the relationship between television and popular music, because I was at the beginning, I didn't know very well which sector I would have fit in, and if I had done some work on popular music, it would have been a mess to make me better fit in the film and television and photography sector. And so it's just a minor thing, but that work, I still have not published that. And this impacts in a way on how you build your career, but also your research interests and the things that you can and cannot or should not so much discuss at a public institutional level. Third element, I'm already running out of time, but please give me another couple of minutes. David, the third point is that what legitimates television and television studies changes geographically as well. I will start from a paradox, and I'm very happy that Alexia talked about the need to go away from the national case study. And it is the paradox about Berlusconi. I always have been asked for decades about what about Silvio Berlusconi at the end of every speech, at every conference. In a way, the Italian mogul, media mogul, and former prime minister, and so on, shows very well which is the actual centrality of television in Italian culture, politics, society, and so on. But at the same time, it has also resulted in a kind of a flattened way of looking at Italian television culture in my country, and I would say especially abroad. Every conference I attended, especially in the first years, always it was the need to kind of delve my research towards this case history and this specific case history. Even if I was talking about something else in the question and answer, there would have been the questions about Berlusconi, and that's another aspect of legitimation, as is television is not deemed relevant enough as a matter of teaching, as a matter of the research. We see that a lot, of course, because one of the strengths of television is being taken for granted, it's being banal, it's being connected to everyday life, everything we very well know, but at the same time, a lot of people kind of substitute the qualities of your object with the qualities of your research on that object, and that's a huge mess for us. Television studies are not getting funding if they are not connected to other more established fields in the arts or social sciences, and that impacts once again our research. Media studies as a larger disciplines, at least in Italy, kind of switched abruptly from the interest in cinema to the interest in digital media with no steps in between. So no radio, no television, and not a lot of other things. And so we kind of, this is the most destruence part. Maybe later we will be a bit more costruence, but it's quite difficult to escape this position. We can try with our work, but of course we need some strategic thinking and to take into account of all these limits we are inserted into. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luca. This was very exciting and interesting, everything that you said. Gary.
Thanks, David. Elke, you are I put together a couple of slides, and Elka, each of these slides have a couple clicks, and probably the best thing would be to just do each slide as we go. I want to just echo my panel colleagues in thanking David and Elka for coming up with this idea, because it made me think about things that I hadn't before. You know, one of the things here, the reason why I put down population in this initial slide here is when we compare and contrast, we've talked about the westernizing of television studies. You know, we can certainly talk about it as being English centric, and you know, and even within the North American context, America centric. You know, with Canada, I think in that. But if you look at the populations, you know, we are half the size of Europe. We are a third of the size of Africa, and we're a fourth of the size of India. So things are certainly unbalanced when you talk about the number of people and you talk about the way that things developed. Elka, if you could please go to the next slide. You know, and what Luca mentioned is that David sent us a number of talking points and prompts for us to be thinking about. And one that I had never thought about, and I put it there, assessing the state of television and television studies. And for the first time, you know, I thought to, you know, the stages of development of television in North America that I put down here in the 2018 conference. We talked about, you know, the different stages of TV, and I certainly believe we have gone into a TV4. But I was always reluctant to think of television as a discipline with the way that the industry developed, and you know, these prompts made me think in that direction, and I was wondering why. And I think that the reason at the very beginning television was held back in North America is it was thought of as a vocational way of studying. So in that way, it was not as legitimate as the longer, more established kinds of the, you know, and of course, those of us studying television and other media, you know, wanted to separate ourselves. We are not part of this. We are analyzing this. But once I did map it side by side, all of a sudden I noticed, you know, that the context of the evolution of the subject in which we were studying actually affected the ways in North America in which it was being studied. So, you know, and that's what I will spend the time I have here talking about. And what's on the slides are more than what I have time to talk about. And that's why I did the slides, so it will be available afterwards. So Elka, if you could please go to the next one. This is also an update of critical studies in television and in debate that happened that Janet McCabe and Kim Akis organized a decade ago. And I went back to my contribution to that, and I noticed that I felt good that a lot of the things that I was talking about, I feel similarly, 10 years later in terms of that. And there were one thing that I agreed with most of what my colleagues were saying in that, except for one. It's that one person in particular made a distinction between television studies and studies in television. I think it was Luca who was talking about, or maybe it was Alexia who was talking about people from outside the discipline, historians or whatever. And, and my feeling is, I'm not saying that all theories and methods and ways of approaching television are created equal, but I think they all make a contribution. And I have my preferences and biases, but they're preferences and biases, that someone else is going to look at it from a different point of view. And if I think the best way to do it is to embrace all of the various ways it's being studied, because even those areas where, say, for instance, quantitative social science is not my bag. You know, I'm more critical cultural in my orientation, but when I read that literature, do I learn something? And the answer is absolutely yes. So I think that's a false dichotomy. The first stage of television development in North America, TV1, was pretty basic. You know, it's also called the classical or broadcast or network era. And it was really marked by practitioner scholars. And I think that's where initially television studies was thought of as vocational. Eric Barnow was asked to do what Asa Briggs did in the UK, is write a multi-volume history of television. And he did, and it's majestic, and it has influenced people ever since. You know, and he worked in the industry for whatever, 10, 15, 20 years before he went to teach at Columbia. And so if you're talking about television studies or the study of television in this first phase, you had this historical view, and you also have quantitative social scientists, because they were thinking of it in very practical terms. Television is a part of our lives. It's not an art. You know, it can be a social force, but I think that's the nature of it. If you do the next click, Elka, and then we go into TV2. And, I think it's marked by a growing sophistication in the content, whichever metaphor you want to use, whether it's quality, whether it's complex TV or whatever. But for the very first time, you had in scholars who actually, their whole life was in academia. But what they did is they came from other fields. And there are probably two people who I will present as being, paragons of two different strains, one being humanities and one being social science. Horace Newcomb, who some of you are probably familiar with TV, The Most Popular Art, and then I think he did 8 editions of TV, The Critical View. And he came out of English. He actually was a student of John Coelty, the genre person, and who really legitimized looking at popular genres within academia. And I think being at Chicago certainly helped him to do that. But Horace did these books, and they were sort of like, oh my God, people are really paying attention to this kind of stuff. That there certainly was a great deal of skepticism. There was not a legitimation that went on. And Todd Gitlin's from a different point of view. Inside Prime Time, you might be aware of, where he did an ethnographic study and went on, to the networks and see how decisions were made and everything. Horace also, his first job was at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and he wrote television criticism for the Baltimore Sun. So all of a sudden you have some legitimacy of becoming more scholarly. But I would say at the end of this, I remember being at a conference and being at a lunch with a bunch of people who studied TV, and we made the point, if we look at Luca, he has those standalone bookcases in back of him there. And I think, and we made the point that all of the television books that existed could probably fit in 2 of those. So it was a nascent field, to say the least. Elka, if you could please go to the last slide. So, we go into TV3, and what we've been talking about, the emphasis, I think, within the industry, because it's more brand oriented, and the best way that these channels can distinguish themselves is come up with challenging hit, buzzworthy kind of programming, that for the first time in North America, programming emphasized complexity and quality over quantity. I think we've gone back to quantity in TV4. But as a result of that, too, I think the legitimation of television as an art form in the culture in general helped advance it as a discipline. And what you had to was a flip where the social sciences really dominated beforehand, where critical cultural studies approaches to television became probably the most prominent. So the arts and humanities sort of took precedent, and social sciences are still contributing, certainly, but probably not as much as they did in earlier times. And probably the biggest thing where we had with Horace got his degree in English and Todd got his degree in sociology, people like me, all of a sudden we were getting our degrees, and that Horace Newcomb still wrote his dissertation on English literature. And, people of my generation were more sort of getting degrees in communication, media, television, or film. In fact, the first job I got at Bowling Green was in a department of radio, television, film. So it was, part of that. And I think when we're thinking of this era, digital convergence is happening. So you're trying to legitimize a discipline at the same time that television is becoming a legacy term as opposed to something distinct unto itself. And we get multi-platforms. We talked about this, David, yesterday, in terms of that, I certainly consider, whether television is coming at us broadcast, whether it's coming to us OTT over the top, or whether it's coming to us cable and satellite, it's all television. In terms of that, and people may disagree, but then getting it to TV4, I think clearly this conference is an example of that, is that we have emerged in, it doesn't mean there aren't pockets, but a more ecumenical way of thinking about television, a more multilingual way of thinking about television, in a more transnational way, that as small as North America was, I think most people in North America, there was so much content coming out of Hollywood and New York that you really didn't spend a lot of time watching anything else, nor from an industry point of view was it getting in. What, use the term foreign programming was British programming. It was to the point that, as late as the turn of the 2000, 98% of the programming that Americans were watching was American-based programming. That has changed. That it's slow where it's happening, but watching programming from all over, and certainly the idea of streaming SVOD TV has allowed that to happen. I think we're in a period of radical convergence. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the panel I'm on in early August. John Ellis talked about the problems of dematerializing TV and video content and what we have access to. As we know, consolidation that these big behemoth corporations are getting, but in that way too, I think it impacts what we study and how we study it. And also scholarship is migrating online. It's less than the journal I'm involved with. Of course, what was most important was how many subscriptions we had and, how good it looked when it came out, where now it's the number of downloads, it's all of that. It's the economics of academic scholarship has changed as well. But in that way, too, let me end with two questions. I guess what I'm implying is there's a certain legitimation to television studies in North America now. That there are some people who will never accept it, and God bless them. But that there are probably a lot of reasons why that is the case, and I think it's there. But at the same time, that has happened now that Barry Diller just came out a month ago, who headed up a couple of movie studios in his career, and said movies are basically over because the difference between movies and television and that it's pretty much a moot point. We are establishing television studies at a time of radical convergence is going on. So, what are we really studying? And I would say the other thing, what the pandemic has done is it accelerates everything in life, that Hollywood has been pretty well established for 110 years. And the biggest change is that 400 miles north, Silicon Valley has come down into it with all the streamers, and they're all involved in that. And is Hollywood going to be Hollywood in 25 years? Meaning that the westernization of entertainment, of popular culture, we are seeing this happening in the industry. Thus, isn't it logical that it's happening as scholars in what we study as well? So let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Gary. This was full of things that are very thought-provoking, and there's a lot of things that I would so love to kind of tap into and ask questions about and also reflect on. So what we're going to do now, if it's okay with everybody, is that we're just going to open this kind of virtual space to discussion and also to questions from the floor. We've heard a lot of things, very sort of interesting perspectives. And if I can exploit my position as chair of the panel, then I would just very briefly reflect on maybe two things. One of them is that listening to all four of you, what struck me was that in spite of all this discussion and the acknowledgement of the diversified character of television as such, the acknowledgement that television as industry, as a kind of cultural form, is so heterogeneous because of the geographical heterogeneities, because of the cultural heterogeneities. What struck me odd was that the sheer number of commonalities that you formulated in regards to the status of television and of the discipline. So in some ways, this seems to me like an interesting paradox that although television is perceived differently, even in the popular kind of imagination and also scholarly, from a scholarly point of view, depending on the geographical location and the cultural, disciplinary, political contexts, the problems that the discipline as such faces seem to have a number of commonalities in terms of questions of legitimation, in terms of funding, in terms of the position between or among disciplines. This is one thing. The other thing comes close to what Ruchi and Alexia were talking about, and I would actually just sum it up as those missed opportunities, to steal Alexia's kind of concept. And I would also kind of tap into what Luca was saying about Berlusconi. So I think that maybe this is a bit of a sort of bold claim, but from a Central European perspective, it seems to me that what Berlusconi is for Italian scholarship, what apartheid is for South African scholarship, post-socialism is for Central European scholarship. So like Luca, I'm having a hard time recalling a conference where I wouldn't be asked questions about the post-socialist, status of Central European televisions, now in the plural. And Alka knows that this is one of my hobby horses, that I actually hate that, because this is such a sort of forced stereotype that as though Central European television was not possible to discuss or to study unless it's through a post-socialist lens. And I have to also admit that Central European TV scholarship is guilty in this respect, because, I mean, to some extent it is guilty, because they are still sort of milking this proverbial cow, so to speak, to legitimize television studies in a Central European context, because just like Rushi explained, or like Alexei explained, television studies is not that established, if it is established at all, in Central Europe. Clara was giving a very interesting talk about this last week when she was talking about the status of television studies in the Czech Republic. And all these things are also related to that. And I think she also mentioned this fact that this legitimation drive results in scholars trying to sort of draw on methodologies that come from different disciplines. So disciplines other than television. So from history, from sociology, media studies, journalism, to actually ground their work somehow, or to sort of establish themselves as scholars of television, which of course raises a number of questions about methodologies. And this would actually be my first question to all four of you, and to anyone who is willing to kind of jump in and bring in their respective point of view. Is there a universal methodology for studying television? Is it possible to have a universal methodology to study television? And if there isn't one, because I would actually be inclined to believe that there is not, it's not possible to have one, then what are the possible consequences for the legitimization of television studies as a discipline? I don't know. Anyone can go.
It's a difficult question. I mean, I think it would be terrible if there was one universal disciplinary language of television. And I think some of the things about doing TV in your particular context, on the one hand, it would be so nice to just be comfortable and not have to explain and justify. But on the other hand, some things you learn are that some of these ideas don't fit with your context. So it needs to be open to kind of disciplinary mixing. Yeah, so I would say it would probably be a dreadful thing, but it would be nice to have a little bit more community, I think, or be able to, in some ways, communicate a little bit more clearly with each other in particular contexts.
Okay, thank you.
I can maybe add something if nobody else wants. It's thank you very much for this very big question. It actually requires some hours to be properly answered, but I guess there's no way there is one single methodology or something like that, because of course we are talking about television studies, especially because the television is so plural in all the objects, in industry, in the reception, and so on. So otherwise, we would fit better inside single disciplinary points of views, and we are just escaping those. But yeah, related to what you were saying before, I guess we have the need of a constant legitimation. We have to legitimize in our national community. We have to legitimize in our international community, and so Berlusconi or the post-socialist can be a way to legitimize. I was always asked about Berlusconi until the moment the other people in the room get to know me and also my work a bit better, and so they started. So in a way, I had to legitimize myself being there, not just as the random Italian, but something like that. We have to legitimize ourselves with other disciplines that have different, more established histories and so on. We have to legitimize ourselves with the general population. What are you studying television about? Why are you doing that? Are you a technician? Are you able to help me with my TV set or something like that? Everybody has been asked that in this room. I'm pretty sure about that. So this is quite a struggle we always have. It's kind of a false consciousness we always have. We feel the need to justify ourselves. We are so used to justify our work that we always spend some portion of the time we have, even when we are at the same time around the same table, to justify the existence and the need. I'm not sure people in literary studies are doing the same. People in film or in sociology or in contemporary history are doing the same. So probably that could be one hope and also one commitment for the future, to leave aside a bit this need to justify ourselves, find another scapegoat in the academia, and kind of go on with our scholarship. Just random thoughts. Sorry for the confusion.
No, I like that, and I think that's precisely why what Gary was talking about when he was talking about this more ecumenical approach, this more inclusive approach in television studies is so absolutely important. Yeah.
I would say that's its strength in a certain sense, that because it's a hybrid interdisciplinary kind of field of study, that to embrace, again, we are all going to have our preferences. But I think that's also part of the process of building legitimation, is going and presenting television research at, the historical association or a sociological association, and vice versa, that legitimation needs horizontal time. It just needs a long amount of time. And I think what's almost, when I think of it in the context of North America, what has almost been just as important as getting scholars from the outside accepting what you do is that getting television, media studies, film scholars getting along in their career, and all of a sudden they become administrators, and they get media courses as general education courses in the university. That there's a political dimension to legitimation as much as there is a theoretical and methodological dimension.
Here I'm struggling with an argument on legitimization of television studies as a discipline in departments in India. And here you're talking about like a very specific methodology for television studies, if there is one, or if there could be one. So I kind of feel very limited in terms of a response to this question. But I was just thinking about it from the point of view of what just Gary said, the political dimension of why certain things or domains become what they become. In India, there's been a huge migration of a lot of people to do their doctoral studies, especially in the US. And in the US, when they kind of did their PhDs, the whole idea was to work on some dimension of India. And I'm precisely speaking about people from film, media, television. And I also put it in the chat box, and everything would be contextualized in a very post-colonial sort of a discourse. And the lens to look at a lot of those things was cinema. And with a lot of cinema in India being available early on, and a sort of like also an imposition of the outside perspective on Indian cinema. For example, very, very famous filmmaker Satyajit Ray, who also maybe a few of you are aware of his work or the kind of work he's been doing. But if we look at all of this, film studies was extremely glamorous for Indian scholars who were studying in American universities or some European universities, who were pursuing their PhDs there. And these were the people who dominated the entire scholarship of media and film studies for decades in India. And that's where somewhere television studies never even got the kind of status, or it did not even emerge, because, just like a lot of you were talking about something, television studies was not even as powerful a case study for anyone as it is with India being absolutely a one channel run by the state broadcaster for ages, and there wasn't, and the only agenda was development and national integration, and possibly nobody wanted to touch that. I think after almost 30 years we are going to be back to square one with the political turmoil right now, but that's for another discussion. But what I'm trying to say here is that the legitimacy of the discipline in itself, for us, there's a lot of struggle, because to validate our position, our stand, it is very important for us to go ahead with also well accepted methodologies and theoretical frameworks, because your work also does not get accepted if it is not contextualized in already accepted theoretical and methodological frameworks. So that is where I am coming from, and that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Add one very quick thing, and I think your comments and what it brings up about that too is we are socialized and taught to think that because our mission is to create original research and ideas and everything like that, that higher education is sort of at the cutting edge. But the truth of the matter is, when you look at it as an institution, that higher education in general is really conservative, and that's one thing we probably all have in common. And in that way, there are careers to be made and disciplines to be protected in that way, letting in new information, even though all of our contemporary theories tell us that the best insights are cross-disciplinary and transdisciplinary. The rules and regulations of higher education and the way you get promoted and raises and everything like that push you in the direction of being much more insular in what you do.
Thank you so much. In the meantime, there's a very interesting discussion unfolding in the chat. I don't know if I think it was Maria who was asking the question about teaching and studying television in specific languages, but there's so much going on in the chat that I don't know if we're okay with just moving to those people who actually want to ask the questions. And Brett had a question, but now I don't see his hand up. So I don't know if Brett still wants to. Yeah.
I took it down because I think you just all answered my question. So move on to somebody else. And the previous discussion answered my question.
Okay, thank you. So then Michael.
Hi there. Can you hear me fine? I know I've had a few issues today. Excellent, wonderful. So I want to sort of really press on this, the political dimension of sort of television studies a little further. So recent debates over sort of net neutrality and sort of Biden and previously Senator Warren's sort of campaign in the US to abolish Section 230, which is the sort of decency act that gives government relative control over the media, breaking up the tech giants and sort of censoring content, has invited, it's invited a number of sort of lawmakers as well as scholars to draw comparisons to the recent censorship moves in India on the media and on media and social media. And therefore, my questions aim towards Ruchi, and I was wondering if you could discuss how the recent censorship moves, and that's the Cinematographic Amendment Bill of 2021, how that is sort of shaping or perhaps endangering television studies. And perhaps you could answer this through the context of discussions about censorship, cultural studies, digital colonialism. I'm seeing a sort of term being sort of bandied around at the moment. Thank you.
Sure. So I would say that's a great question. See, it's a very difficult question to respond to in many ways, because there is also a very direct impact of how all of this is unfolding in terms of the content ideology that was kind of shaping the whole narrative of streaming platforms in India. So just to put it in perspective, Indian television in particular, and when I say I talk about linear television, Indian television in particular has followed a very, very safe, ideologically a very safe sort of a journey. It has had, always, and
Ruchi, you're muted.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I don't know where I got muted, but what I was trying to say is that Indian television has always had a very safe sort of a space. It's maintained a very safe ideological position for years. So even when the private players came to India in the early 1990s, when media got privatized in India, there were stories of different kinds, especially both for fictional television and as the news channel space opened up. Suddenly from a state-run media narrative, there was an alternative media narrative on the television screen, which was available to so many people. And this was a very interesting sort of a trajectory for a democracy, a very vibrant democracy, for the conversations that were possible, for the arguments and counter arguments that could take place on television, and television shaped it significantly. However, over a period of time, therefore, of course, like something called television rating points, that became the biggest currency to run television, because in India, subscription to any kind of media is extremely, extremely low priced. People don't want to pay for the media. In fact, one of our news websites goes with the tagline that if you do not pay for news, you get paid news. But that's how, so that's how it kind of works, that you don't want to pay for any kind of media content. That's been the mindset with which the largest consumer base, was constantly the industry was negotiating with. Having said that, all of it changed, and there was the invasion of the digital, and all of this happened. And also, you are aware that right now in India, there is more like a right-wing political brass, which is the leadership of the country, which is the government of the country. And there is a strong ideological environment in the country. It's more polarized than it ever was before, like many other instances from different parts of the world that we continue to hear. Now, in all of this, something that was trying to be very courageous and brave was the content on these streaming platforms, particularly. And like I mentioned in my brief overview earlier, there are more than 40 of them now, and YouTube, which is the most democratic and open to people, and how a lot of people are there. Now, recently in February, the current government passed some OTT regulation bill, which borders significantly on censorship. And now, according to that, and there were a lot of triggers for it. For example, Netflix in India has been doing a lot of original productions. Amazon Prime in India has been doing a lot of original productions in Indian languages, primarily in the language called Hindi, which is the considered to be the national language of the country, which is very, very ironical with a country which has more than 50 languages and hundreds of dialects, but so be it. So now and there were very powerful there was very powerful politically provocated fictional content in the last couple of years, where TV was getting more and more safe in its tonality, where news media in particular was totally biased towards the government. This alternative voice on OTT platforms was attracting a lot of viewership, and there was a lot of conversation around it. I think those triggers existed for this new regulation to come out. That's one. In particular, there has been a lot of attack on especially content being produced, like just last week, I had a couple of my former students who now work with Netflix relating how incidents of how their offices were stoned because they commissioned a particular script and all of that. So that is like another kind of TV, which was like opening up a lot of alternative narratives for a world which was absolutely being fed a singular monolithic dimensional narrative on linear television. People are still doing it, but they are being more pragmatic about it, because I will like to say that, yeah, I mean, it is right now, it's scary. It's scary for creators, it's scary for audiences, it's scary to put it out there, but it's having an impact. And I think also it will be very difficult for a lot of people to pursue academic scholarship in this space, which is critical and maybe activist, bordering on activism to some level, because that's getting tough, and it's all out in the open. So yeah, these are challenges. I don't know if I've been able to answer your question correctly, because I also get very emotionally overwhelmed responding to something like this. Yeah.
No, of course, and thank you very much. It's such a rich answer, and I have a writer currently who's contributing to an edit collection, and she's writing. She's an Indian scholar who's writing about Indian television and some of the sort of tensions, and she's really grappling with this on a sort of personal level as well as an academic level, and from a disciplinary perspective. So it's really fascinating to have such a rich answer. So thank you very much. And I think it's something we need to sort of carefully consider, because as I said, I opened the question with the context of the US. The UK has also sort of questioned similar sort of interventions from sort of government over sort of media. So I think it's very relevant that we all sort of listen, and I think these conversations will evolve as we progressively become sort of more nationalist in our sort of in our media. So something we can all think about. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we move on to Derek's question, just a very quick note on the ongoing discussion about language and language as a form of legitimization. So in Central Europe, there's even a kind of fetishistic obsession with scholars having to actually publish that work internationally and in English, preferably. So there's a kind of separate categorization for stuff that you publish in English and stuff that you publish in your native language or in the language of the country. And anything that would be published in English would be worth much more from the point of view of academic capital, if that makes sense at all. So this kind of adds to this dimension that we're exploring about language that we're exploring here. Okay, Derek.
Hi, so many ideas and things to respond to. I'm going to resist the urge to just let the ideas explode out and actually pick up on some of the ideas that Mareka and others have talked on, which is getting me thinking about some of the issues I'm faced in terms of teaching. I'll try and focus this. I won't do my background bit. Okay. Okay. So I mentioned about textbooks, how publishers are pushing, the UK's tradition of TV studies pretty strong, but I'm getting pushed US textbooks, which don't necessarily cover UK regulation, context, history, and approaches. If they do, I keep coming across things that they get factually wrong, and absolutely the ideas that people, that Rufi and Alexia in particular were talking about, the importance of cultural context, the difference of cultural context, that's not necessarily coming across. And that's even between the US and the UK. So I can only imagine what it's like elsewhere. So this brings me, I think, to one of my linked questions, which is textbooks. How do you teach this? And the other one is a related question. We have, in our university, we've agreed that students can use non-English language sources as long as the majority of their sources are English language, because that's the language the degree is taught in. They can use other sources. And so, that's about opening out. And we get lots of Chinese students, so we get Chinese sources, which I, of course, cannot personally understand. And I was wondering, so 2 questions about how is anyone else handling this language issue, and also about sources and textbooks.
I can talk to textbooks, because we've made a decision a couple of years back just to not use textbooks, and that there's 2 reasons for that. The one is we found that we always had to supplement whatever textbook we could find with things that would actually relate to our context, and to also frame a lot of the stuff for the students, because it just often doesn't make sense to them because it's so radically different. from their own experiences. Although I think South African young people are kind of used to negotiating, we always kind of are doing that. But the other reason is just costs. Many of our students can't afford textbooks. So it was really well received that we just scrapped them entirely. And instead we create our own readers. We get the copyright for the readers and we put them together for the students. And in fact, now we're doing them digitally, but they just haven't worked for us at all.
We tend to do the same with just giving individual readings, but it's trying to find that source material that we can use that has the right culture and assumptions. Sorry, I think.
No, just to add something, actually, the answer to your question about textbooks relates a lot also with the ongoing discussion started by Mareike in the chat. In Italy, language is a problem. We are teaching in Italian. Students are reading in Italian. You can add something in English and kind of thing that master students can understand that, but they will not be happy about that. You can do that in the dissertations and so on. So more or less, we kind of overcome the issue about the nationality of the television scholarship because we have to find ourselves in Italian, to write ourselves in Italian, and so on. And often you have this kind of texts that are talking about Italian television and US television and UK television. Nothing about French television or Spanish television, nothing about Indian television or South African television. And that's, of course, another issue. Of course, because we have the first knowledge about Italian television and about something else. And we have the second-hand knowledge of all the books that are written in English and we can access. Sometimes we can access also French and Spanish ones, but it's kind of more difficult. So yeah, it's everything entangled. The way we are writing about television on the European and global scale or in the national arena, and these are double circuits, at least from an Italian perspective, which are not connected or rarely connected. The way we research is also the way we teach, and is also the way we can discuss about television in situations like this, and so on. So it's everything fits. It's not ideal, but we are struggling with the same issues in every piece of our work, I guess.
Thank you. We have one question from Sethara. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Apologies if I didn't.
Hi, thank you. Yes, to my shock, yes, you pronounced it very correctly. After a long time.
I'm happy.
Hi, everyone. So I was very involved in the whole conversation, especially with the rise of the methodology thing that David brought up, because I'm so intertwined with that particular methodology crisis here. I have just submitted my thesis. I worked in a private television channel for 10 years. And with that experience, I felt an urge to do research on a lot of behind the screen productions. And that was the major reason why I took up my MPhil. And after my MPhil, I got my PhD. Now that I've submitted my thesis, but still I have a lot of questions that revolves around the real subject of television studies. The major thing is, my urge to do the research itself was because I had a lot of first-hand experience and witnessed a lot of crises and other issues that was happening behind the television, which I wanted to research on. But when I was taught, it was majorly only case studies and content analysis that most of the professors suggested for television studies as such, and hardly maybe discourse analysis. There was no other useful methodology which really helped me bring all what I wanted to bring inside my thesis. And finally, I came across this autoethnography, and I took the efforts to understand the methodology. And I felt somewhere autoethnography helped me in bringing out my personal experiences into the thesis. One major thing that I see in, okay, I'm not very exposed to television studies outside India, but here, people who work in the industry hardly come out and do researches. And me being a woman who has worked as an assistant director, associate director, here especially television work means it doesn't just define your particular role. They expect you to do the costume coordination. They expect you to do the properties also the PR, that is the artist coordination, floor management, and script writing. So all these things together is what an assistant or associate director does. And I have so much of urge to bring out so many things into the thesis, and I wasn't able to, but yes, finally autoethnography helped me. But my question is, have you, being in this field, have you seen other methodologies being experimented with people? That is one of my questions. Second is, what can we do to bring in more of the behind the screen people into academics? That has been such a mind-boggling question for me, because whenever I used to ask for one permission to come and write an entrance exam in the university, the whole of my television crew used to make fun at me. What are you going to do studying? We just did our degree. I'm just 12th standard and I'm earning $1.5 lakh. So why do you really want to study? So they have no idea about what academicians are doing in this television industry as such. So there is a complete demotivation there. But I feel being having a first-hand experience there, we could bring in a complete different, perspective to the television studies discipline as such. So I think I have emotionally brought in too many things. I hope you got my point. Yeah, thank you.
David, I just have the cultural context of what Sithara is saying. So I'll just respond to a couple of things because I think the others, she would like to hear the others. But Sithara, I understand that this PhD is being submitted to some department in India, yeah, in one of the Indian universities. Yeah, I get it correct? Oh, right. So see, because these problems are very typical of the departments, and I'll tell you, there are two primary things here. One, of course, is that television studies, and I think that's what I've been trying to kind of put across, does not have academic legitimacy as a discipline yet in India. And why you were forced to possibly pick up content analysis or case study as a methodology is because there is a lot of imposition of mass communication as a domain on television studies. And unfortunately, mass communication is still trying to sometimes get out of its positivist context. It still is going to old social science, quant, and sometimes what they call qual sort of methods and all of that. So that's one thing. That's why you do not find the methodological diversity that you are so passionately wanting to find for your work. The second thing is that I think in India, we haven't been able to create an academic culture, a culture that allows you to get into media studies, a communication department with an intention of being an academic or a theoretician. The culture is still that you get into that department, you do your graduate or postgraduate degree to become a professional in the media industry. And therefore, the orientation of the programs is extremely vocational and professional in nature. And therefore, a lot of people who get into the industry sometimes are also not able to understand because they are not sensitized towards the context of how this entire domain also is academically, theoretically so fulfilling to engage with. And I think that's a gap that a lot of programs in the last 10 years, and 10 years ago you must have done your master's, but from the last 10 years particularly, there has been an endeavor in university departments with people like us, and there is a community of us scholars who are struggling to get in this third dimension. Unfortunately, that dimension is dominated completely by media and culture studies right now, but I'm sure that more appreciation of diverse things, in the domain will come out. So I think what you also have struggled with is a systemic environment that's like not changed for years. So that's one, and that's my 2 bits to it. Yeah.
Anyone else care to comment? Any other comments to Sithara's question? Or,
I can add a couple of things, but just
okay.
I'm not sure if they will be so helpful. The first one is something that actually comes out of all the discussion we are doing. It's something that I'm thinking, and sorry for not being an English speaker, native speaker, and so on, putting together very random thoughts in a very random language. But I'm not sure. We are discussing here something like television studies can or should be kind of an island, kind of something that is legitimized and able to stand up in itself. At the same time, television studies are more or less kind of crossroads, to quote very influential past research, or bridges, or something that stays in between with its object, with a lot of different disciplines. And so, of course, sort of ethnography, all the anthropological instruments, and the sociological one, and the historical ones are all instruments that can build the methodology of television studies, where we can pick some of the tools inside of a larger instrument box. And so maybe in dealing with some teachers or colleagues, you can position yourself as a television studies scholar who actually uses some kinds of perspectives and some kinds of objects inside this larger field. So I'm doing media industry studies with ethnographical methods and so on in television studies, and so putting together kind of a document, a passport, which is a bit more complex than just being a television studies scholar or stuff like that. And this is the first thing. The second one is related to the industry people, to the relationship with the industry and so on. I'm not sure it's working everywhere in the same way, but in Italy it's quite helpful to invite professionals, invite industry people at the universities, not just ask them to help you, but in order to establish a connection, starting you to help them. They need another kind of legitimation. Sometimes academia can give them this kind of legitimations. Most of the people I talked with are very happy to come and give a lecture and be interviewed publicly and meet the students and so on. And this is always a great start. Then when you are made them your friends, you can also talk about your research and start to interview them and so on. So that could be a way, kind of a trick to be more connected with industry professional, and to also advance your and our research.
Yeah, I would just echo what has said in terms of that I think doing television research within a broader context, whether it be media studies or depending on, because it's such a new discipline, it's popped up at different universities in different ways, but I think it's also important that it doesn't get hidden, that there is a way to, and I think certainly in North America, what has happened, and I think critical studies in television is an example of that, is that over time, people establish their own journals. The first time I ever did a television criticism paper, critical cultural paper, I did as a graduate student, and I sent it out to a journal now, which will remain unnamed, and it was a graduate student paper, so it needed lots of work and everything. But the critique of it was that that's the problem with our field, that we're paying attention to these kinds of things. In the sense that we do film, we do not do television. The other side of that, I would say, after having been involved in this for a while, is that it's truly exciting to be at the birth of a discipline, and that as frustrating as it is, clawing your way to do stuff, and to have legitimacy and all of that kind of thing, that it also is, I don't want to name a discipline, but it's also much more exciting than, if I had gotten my PhD in blah, blah, blah. You know, in the sense that, you know, being able to develop, this really is developing new ideas and allowing a new unit of analysis in. And we all know how important television is to all of our lives and all of the people around us. The one last thing I'll say is what people have been talking about with television. I would say there is a similarity, especially in the States, because you know, in Canada, you have a French area as well as an English area, but that especially when I was an undergraduate, I don't know if there would be film studies in the States if it was just American film. Because the idea is that American film was sort of entertainment, and I know it's been legitimized more now, but most of the people who were writing about it were, like, I would say, Western European, you know, but you know, a lot of the literature was not, the best literature was not in English, and it needed to, you know, what we have now, great with the internet. You know, I don't know how many times I get articles that's written in another language, and you know, if you have a certain subscription to it, you just click the button and it translates. Not perfectly, but at least you can comprehend what's going on. And I would say in the Journal of Popular Film and Television too, one of the biggest changes has been, I would say, a third of our, and it's a big change, a third of our submissions now come from outside North America. They're written in English, you know, but it's a slow process, but I think all of the signs are, this is what's happening.
Thank you so much, Gary. Elke, I'm asking if we still have time, if we're good to continue, if there's any more questions, or are we? Yeah,
we've kind of run out of time.
Right.
Unless
okay.
there's anything pressing. So the first people have to leave as well and have left already.
Yeah.
So it might be worthwhile
to yeah. Okay, so in that case, I think if there's no further questions or comments, then we will just wrap up the session. And please join me in thanking Rushi, Alexia, Luca, and Gary for their input, for their very valuable inputs. I enjoyed this session immensely. And once again, it was an honor to have been chairing it. Thank you for everybody's input, both here in the discussion and also in the chat. And thank you, everybody. And we shall see each other in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And just to let you know that the next session is obviously tomorrow evening at, sorry, let me just clarify. Tomorrow's session is at 3 o'clock, not evening. Well, it will be evening for Rushi.
For some.
not for everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Elka. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Luca, Alexia, Gary. Bye-bye. Yeah.
Bye. Amazing panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.